And welcome to Catholics Coast to Coast. I'm Ace McKay, always loving our journey together, especially through Lent, that allows us to find more conversations that deepen our walk with God. And Podcast Central is a plethora of conversations that are always there for you, and you'll find some of your favorites. That way you can like and subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts, or just go to EWTN.com/podcast to find all of them. So before we even get into the meat and potatoes of what's happening this week, let's get into God's Word, which is the ultimate meat and potatoes, as we do so with your word on the Word.
So what's the best thing in the world? Like the best thing ever?
Well, are we talking about like physical or something intangible? Actually, no. My life and the love that I get to share with the people in it.
Aw, that's nice. But it's not the best. I mean, I think there's something better.
Okay, well, what could be better? You're not going to tell me until after the open, are you?
No.
Hi, I'm Veronica, and this is Melissa. Welcome back to the Word on the Word. Today, we're going to take a look at the second reading for the fifth Sunday of Lent. Okay, Melissa, what's the answer?
It's in the reading, of course. Paul writes to the Philippians that he counts everything as a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus. So what you said is a good answer, but it's through your faith in Christ that those things are fortified.
You know, you're right. I found that my relationship with Christ directly affects all of my other relationships. When I don't put the time and the effort into my faith because I think I'm too busy, all of my relationships suffer. I don't spend enough time with my family or with my friends, and I even miss out on a lot of sleep. But when I stop and thank God for all the things He's given me, whether they're good or bad, I realize it's only through Him I'm capable of anything.
Paul writes that through our faith in Christ, we come to know Him and the power of His resurrection, so that we may share in His suffering, become like Him, and if we work hard enough, attain the resurrection from the dead.
Even Paul himself didn't think he'd made it on his own. Christ makes us His own, so it's up to us to answer the call. You know, I think nothing will compare to what awaits us in our eternal reward if we work hard enough here on earth.
Our challenge for you this week is to take a moment in the busiest part of your day and simply thank God for that moment. Ask Him to strengthen your faith so you may glorify Him through your actions.
And don't forget to catch us next week here on EWTN.
Bye.
Toodles.
Great Lenten reflections as we continue Catholics Coast to Coast. You want to find out more on Word on the Word through Lent and into Easter season, just go to Podcast Central. EWTN.com/podcast is the easiest way to find it, or subscribe wherever you like to stream. And as we continue with Catholics Coast to Coast, we are finding out what it means to be weird again. Let me be frank. It's one of our latest podcast family members to join Podcast Central. And as the readings of the work of the early church fathers have brought countless non-Catholic Christians into the church, it has also strengthened so many Catholics who are ready for the heart of the church again. So let's dive in as we let Frank be frank. And we're going to get into the conversation now on Catholics Coast to Coast.
This is Let Me Be Frank, Bishop Caggiano's weekly platform to speak to featured guests and to speak directly to you. We're on 1350 AM and 103.9 FM in Connecticut, on Sirius XM, on YouTube, or anywhere you get your podcasts, including on the Veritas Catholic Network mobile app on your phone. We're able to bring you this show thanks to Foundations in Faith. Foundations in Faith is dedicated to transforming pastoral care ministries in the Diocese of Bridgeport through its 11 distinct funds. And this month, we continue to highlight the St. John Paul II Fund. The JP2 Fund supports Diocese of Bridgeport parishes that have innovative approaches to faith formation programs for all ages and groups. To learn more about the JP2 Fund and all the work of Foundations in Faith, go online to foundationsinfaith.org. Okay, here we go. This is Let Me Be Frank on the Veritas Catholic Network. I'm Steve Lee, and it is my great pleasure, as always, to introduce Bishop Frank Caggiano.
Steve, good to see you.
Excellency, nice to see you too.
Yeah, in the midst of Lent, spring coming here to the north. It's tremendous.
Yes. The weather is getting nicer. Can I ask you, are you going this Friday to the Malta House concert at Fairfield University?
Friday? I don't think so. But I don't remember, to be right. I live my life just day by day, to be very
Wherever
honest.
Debbie tells you to go.
Exactly.
No. We
why?
went.
Why do you ask?
I'm going to be there with my kids and with Rula, and we went last year and it was fantastic. This guy Mark Schultz is an award-winning Christian music artist and gives this concert, and the proceeds go to Malta House. So
tremendous! Tremendous.
Yeah.
Maybe I am. I really don't know. I don't remember.
maybe I'll see you there.
Could be. I'm very happy I'm here when I'm supposed to be.
Yes. Right. Well, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just curious if I was going to see you in
No.
person.
But we have a great guest who's talking about one of my favorite topics on earth.
You love patristics, and so I had to line up. Well, you mentioned that you were reading this book independently, and so I had to line up David. So let me jump into it. Our guest today is David Augustin, and David is associate editor of Word on Fire Academic and managing editor of the New Ressourcement, which is a quarterly journal of philosophy and theology.
Wow.
And somebody asked me recently, like, why am I so quiet when we have guests on? And I
Yeah,
think
why are you, by the way? Yes, we would like to know.
I think today is going to be a perfect example of why, because I like to stop and listen and learn and take notes when I have two very smart people having a conversation.
Yeah, right. David, one, not two. One.
So David Augustin has written numerous articles. He's written a book titled Christ and the Altar Fire, and he's edited, the subject of today's conversation, a book called The Early Church Fathers Collection from Word on Fire. This is going to be a great conversation. So David Augustin, thank you so much for joining us on Let Me Be Frank.
Thank you, Steve, and Bishop Frank.
Yeah, my pleasure. No, I'm delighted you're here. David, my first question, perennial. Tell us the story of faith in your own life that led you to do this sort of work for Word on Fire.
Well, let me think how I can give an abbreviated version of this, because the story is as long as my life. I wasn't raised in any particular faith tradition. My mom was raised Serbian Orthodox, and my dad was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. By the time I grew up in the 80s, I wasn't really raised as either of those. And my grandma kind of filled the void there. And so she kind of gave me kind of like secret instruction as a Jehovah's Witness. And when I was younger, I was a little resentful about that. I love my grandma. As I've gotten older, though, while I disagree with a number of their theological tenets, I kind of, she's kind of like the Russian babushka, kind of handing on the faith in its absence to the best. She handed on what she had. And despite, some of my difficulties with their creed, I still nevertheless had, from a very young age, had the sense of something scripture, something, God, something Jesus Christ, something divine judgment, et cetera, kind of baked into my consciousness, which I was never able to totally escape. By my late teens, kind of in college, I was more or less if not an outright atheist, at least an agnostic. And I didn't, practice any kind of like religion whatsoever for any number of years until I had, I just kind of hit rock bottom about summer of 2004. And then I had what were the beginnings of a conversion experience. And I do chalk at least part of that up to my grandma, just because during this whole time when I was kind of wandering through this wilderness, I sometimes do public talks, and I like to joke with people that I was kind of being like hunted by a murdered Jew, because he never totally escaped my consciousness. And so I'm this kind of like secular guy living in the upper Midwest, and I look around the corner, and then I'm being like hunted down by this carpenter, with holes in his hands. And, for whatever reason, I was never able to totally escape that. And I was an atheist by 2004, and I lived near a Catholic church, actually. I didn't know anything whatsoever about Catholicism. But I would actually walk down there and sit outside of a pieta outside and, God, if you exist, which I contest. But if you exist, so something has to change in my life and help me. Mm-hmm. And he did. And I began actually reading scripture in about August of 2004. And by late September, while reading scripture, I had a series of kind of like, I'll call them religious experiences. I don't know how to describe them better than that. Partly intuitive, partly in the imagination while reading scripture, partly triggered by the scriptural prompts that I was reading. But, I saw Jesus. I was reading Ephesians chapter 4, where it says, he ascended on high and gave gifts to men, quoting, I think, Psalm 69. And I saw Jesus, the motion was reversed, and I saw Jesus coming towards me on the clouds. And I received two propositions at that time, Jesus is Lord and he is risen. And from that moment to this day, and that was over 20 years ago now, I've never been able to escape the force of Jesus's bodily resurrection. And with the proposition Jesus is Lord, that began to overcome some of my nascent Arianism that I'd had when I was kind of raised as a Jehovah's Witness, because the witnesses don't believe in the full divinity of Jesus of Nazareth. They think he was a created intermediary prior to his enfleshment. And sometimes in their literature, they identify it with the Archangel Michael. And so they believe he's some kind of created intermediate. So that's basically straight up Arianism. And then they don't believe in the divinity of the Holy Ghost. But that was the beginning of, I couldn't articulate it. And I even resisted Trinitarian doctrine formally for a while. But the kind of like the outworking of the profession of his lordship is it connected it with, Yahweh from the Old Testament for me. Mm-hmm. And I began to develop a very strong sense of Jesus's divinity. Well, in late fall of 2004, I didn't know any Christians, so I went and found some Pentecostals, and they baptized me. It never occurred to me to walk into the Catholic Church outside of which I used to pray. And they baptized me, and I was a Pentecostal for about 3 years. Come about 2007, I started becoming dissatisfied with aspects of my Pentecostal faith, and I actually caught a little bit of an episode of The Journey Home on with Marcus Grode and EWTN, and they had a woman named Leona Choi. I'm sure I talked to her on the phone once, but I'm sure she's long dead now. She was in her 70s at the time. She'd been an evangelical missionary to China on and off for about half a century. And she converted to Catholicism in her late 70s. Under the influence, actually, of one of the young women that she mentored who converted to Catholicism. And Leona recommended a volume, just a kind of an introductory volume on the Church Fathers. And that included, among other things, at least some quotes from Ignatius of Antioch, who's included in the Church Fathers volume I edited. I included everything he wrote in there. At least that's, because Ignatius, as Ignatius's epistles are so powerful, and a lot of early church stuff. Like I didn't include any Athenagoras of Athens. I thought about it, but you read this and it's like, this is so turgid. This would require a lot of explanation. With Ignatius, that's not really required. It's almost like the Pauline epistles. They're so direct and immediate. But anyways, I started reading Ignatius of Antioch, and he talks about the Catholic Church. You see the quote unquote monarchical episcopacy over the local church emerging at a very early time period. He clearly has some kind of, what I'll call like a high view of the Eucharist, et cetera, however you want to parse that metaphysically. And this introduced me to an entire different thought world that I didn't know existed, because as a Protestant, I don't even remember anybody explicitly teaching this to me, but you inherit a certain declension narrative, a certain narrative of decline in the West and in Christianity in the West in particular, where, what we start out with is some kind of pure apostolic Christianity, and then insert a date, there's a corruption that happens, and the church, eventually ceases to preach the pure gospel, and then it becomes something else altogether, and it's kind of transmogrified over time. And so by the time you get to the High Middle Ages with all the monks and the incense, and then certainly by the kind of the late early Renaissance, kind of Reformation period, what you have is no longer Christianity. And so then we need to go back to the scriptures, sola scriptura, and all of that stuff. So you inherit some sort of narrative decline, whether you put the decline with the death of John the Apostle, whether you put it with, Emperor Constantine and the Constantinization and the sort of imperial Christianity in the 4th century, whether you put it with Hildebrand in the 11th century, whatever, pick your date. But you end up with some kind of narrative of decline. And what that book did, and then it got me reading, was it introduced me to what I'm going to call just here like historic Christianity. And that's the Christianity that you do see witnessed to obliquely, but in the Church Fathers and in a variety of ways, in terms of what they accept and what they don't accept, what they talk about, what they take for granted. And I still think that it's not that the Church Fathers, when we talk about the Church Fathers, it's not like they per se agree about everything. They fight about cats and dogs about everything like we do. But there's a background agreement about any number of things, for example, in the Fathers that we would dispute and that they take for granted. And that's what impressed me. They fight about everything. And some of the things that they fought about are settled for us, or at least should be. Right. And so that was my introduction to historic Christianity. And you read enough of this stuff. And I was, I remember going to some services of the Serbian Orthodox Church, for example, when I was younger. And I'm like, oh, this sounds a lot like this. But then I also start like, well, what's this big Roman Catholicism, the largest church in the world over here? And then that got me thinking. And then, what are these claims of the papacy? Actually, these go back a really long way, and they strike me as having like some sort of like strong historical credibility to them. And so with the introduction to that, it's like, my sort of Pentecostalism, qua Pentecostalism or qua Protestantism began to shatter. And I had to go in one of two different directions. And ultimately, I joined the Catholic Church in about 07, 08. So I've been a Catholic for about 17 years now. And then in my early 30s, I began sort of like gradual kind of graduate study. And then the big thing that changed my life academically was I was just going to school part-time. But they hired, I don't know if you know who Matthew Leverin is. He's a well-known theologian that's written, probably about 50, 60 books now. And they asked me to be his research assistant in 2013. And I was handcuffed to like just a theological hurricane. And so that's what's completely changed my life and given me all the opportunities that I've had since then. And that's
so your background is philosophy and theology, both.
Well, let's say I'm an amateur philosopher in the sense that philosophy operates interior to theology, and you have to have some but competence with this stuff. And the more you can't, as a theologian, you can't be a good enough philosopher.
Right.
You really can't. But I don't have per se a background in philosophy. I've just had to kind of piece it together and cobble it together. But my training is quote unquote in systematic theology.
Best way to learn it.
Yeah.
I struggle through it without a doubt. What a fascinating story. You are one of so many who have, as an adult, journeyed towards Catholic faith, and in the struggle have realized an authentic discipleship, which then affects the lives of so many people. This is the book, one of the books that we're going to talk about, right? And it's published by Word on Fire. So how did you get connected to Word on Fire?
Oh, the short version here is I was teaching at a Catholic high school in Texas in 2021, 2022. And, and I was a senior honors kind of theology teacher and so forth. And I really enjoyed that. I was hit with a really horrendous case of COVID that year that left me unable to speak and walk I was sick for about 9 months, and I was pretty crippled for about 4 months. And,
wow.
And, it's your first year teaching at a high school and you miss 4 or 5 months. That's not sustainable. And I tried to show up as much as I could, but my class very quickly turned into the Passion of Dr. Augustine. And as I was trying to they were giving me a little microphone so I could whisper, even though I could barely speak, and I was having breathing issues. And then, but then I'm walking around campus. I walked from my classroom to the bathroom once, and with my cane, and I couldn't make it, and I got stuck in the hallway, and people are standing around me like, "What do we do?" And so then I ended up going on leave, and I ended up not coming back. Meanwhile, my wife's pregnant with our second child, and it's, we're like, this is not stable employment right now, just because of the school treating me very well, but just because of where your health's at. And I emailed a couple of my mentors, including Dr. Levern, and I just said, I'm in a situation that's not working here. What are my options? And then they helped put together this job for me at Word and Fire, which came out of nowhere.
Listen, how do you feel now, if I may be so bold?
I'd say my health's like 90% better. I did have a little bit of decline after that I haven't gotten back. But at the same time, once you're really sick and then you start to, you get the flu and then you start to feel better, like even if you're not 100%, you still feel good.
Yeah.
I think I returned to about 90% of but also I am getting to be middle-aged. And so part of that is just decline over time too.
Wait till you get on Medicare. Forget it. No. Forget it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You are the third person in the last week who has shared with me some really significant challenge with either COVID when they had it, or this long COVID that follows after COVID. And I begin to wonder to myself if that's not going to be more and more the stories of people who were infected with COVID, because the virus really doesn't, my understanding is it becomes dormant, but you don't really ever expel it completely, right? But please God, you've had your worst. Your crucible is over, please God.
Yeah, and I mean, I got it about a year ago again, and then I was walking with a cane for about a month, but then I bounced back pretty quickly.
Yeah,
so it some of the population they're asymptomatic. For some people, it's a head cold. I'm one of the people that I wasn't hospitalized, although we did take me to the ER, et cetera. But well, we don't need to go on my whole medical diagnosis here, but it produced breathing issues for me that
Wow.
That was one of the biggest crosses I've had to bear in my life so far. Is just laying on the ground, being unable to breathe is very challenging.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Wow. Well, thank God you're better, and thank God you're here. I have two questions.
Okay.
Question number one, I never heard the term church fathers. Who are we referring to?
Well, so first of all, it's a loose category. And who's in and who's out might depend a little bit on who you ask. Mm-hmm. But it's a narrower category than if we were to say something like early ecclesiastical writer or early church writer. That's going to be broader than the term church father, because that would include heretics, for example. That would include anybody that was like writing in who was a Christian whose work survived, for example, in the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th century. At least if they were loosely associated with the Catholic Church. The term church father is generally going to be referred to people that have a certain mark of orthodoxy on them, that were kind of influential in the church, that were recognized as such. It's going to have some of those criteria attached to it, which is going to further distinguish it from people that were alive during this period. Now, when I say that this is an early church fathers collection, I chose that title carefully, and then I explain it away a little bit in my initial introduction, because I actually include someone that's not a church father in here, and I include some anonymous works in here as well. And so this really it's like a collection of 2nd century writings, many of whom are church fathers, many of which are, kind of de facto church fathery, even though they're anonymous. And then I also include Tertullian. just because he's influential, you should read some of him. But he also drifts off into, the quote unquote Montanist heresy later in his life.
Right.
And so I included some of his early stuff, though, because it really is informative.
Right. The truth of the matter is, I was going to mention that because I noticed it as I read through the book. For our listeners, we use the word heretic, and it has a very pejorative meaning. And in fact, these people have fallen into error theologically. But most of the time, if not all of the time, it was in an honest pursuit of the truth that they could not fully understand or articulate or express or whatever it is. And they do serve a purpose. Now, you may disagree, David, so correct me, but they help clarify the truth, right? They help someone else to clarify the truth in the give and take of the conflict. So this isn't really a story of villains when we talk about heretics, right? They didn't succeed, but they tried to articulate the truth in an orthodox way, but they contributed in the articulation of the faith in an orthodox way. Is that too benign? Is that too merciful a reading for the heretics?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, so I guess the case in point here is Tertullian, and when we say like the Montanist heresy, I mean, first of all, it's not even clear whether he died in the peace of the church or not. I went through a bunch of literature on this, and it's just people debate about this, and we'll never know for sure because this all happened in a low information environment. But Tertullian's concern, at least, is, I mean, kind of the early sort of manifestations of prophecy are dying off in the church. And in more particular, he thinks that the church's discipline, as the church is taking in more and more people, is becoming more lax than it was in preceding periods. And you see, I think that same criticism implicit, for example, in some of the monasticism of the 4th century, where they're like, oh, like we're just taking all these people and let's go off into the desert. And so there's a certain striving for purity there, which I think is understandable, right? And so I think that Tertullian has a positive aim there, and this is endlessly debated about Arius in the 4th century. It's easy to just typecast Arius as a villain and, he denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. Except he also seems to be holding on to an earlier kind of Alexandrian sort of Neoplatonic tradition, which identifies the Logos as a kind of subordinate principle to the deity. And the exact, sort of metaphysical status of this being is being disputed as the doctrine of, creation ex nihilo becomes further clarified. And whatever you want to say of Arius, and there's any number of issues here, he does seem to have had a point that was comprehensible within his historical framework. And we actually grew in our faith and started to really hash out dogma as such, and then also the Nicene dogma that the Son is consubstantial with the Father, precisely in response to his errors. But honestly, if you read a lot of the earlier fathers we recognize as Orthodox, they lived in a time period where we didn't have these clarifications, and they will say things about the Son that are, jarring to later ears, but we read them charitably by assuming that if the question had been presented to them as it was later, we would have answered it our way.
Without a doubt. My famous, not to veer off too much from this, but my famous example of this is Nestorius, right? So Nestorius claimed that that Our Lady was the Christotokos, right? She was the bearer of the Christ. And Cyril, who was the person that I studied for my doctorate, of course, is the Theotokos, which is the mother of God. But just for clarification, I mean, she is also the Christotokos. She is also the mother of the Christ. But it is more than that, obviously, because what you believe of Christ is the issue, right? And we believe him to be God. So I think, it's that is why everyone should read the Fathers.
Yeah.
Everyone should see the progression of thought. And a lot of the struggles that are in modern terminology, many of them are not new. The Fathers struggled with them in their own contexts, in their own ages. They also struggled with them and came up with what we consider to be and revealed truth, Orthodox faith. There's a lot to learn from the Fathers. That's why I commended this book even before you and I met on the podcast. I mentioned this to Steve. This is really important reading. So why did you? My other question too is, what does an editor do exactly in something like this, in a book like this?
Yeah, so I'm an editor in a number of capacities right now. That's literally my full-time job, and I do different things on different books. With this book, what I meant specific, so it's going to depend on the project, and it's going to be a little specific to the project. With this book, what I did was I selected the translations that we were going to use. Partly that was based on quality issues. Partly that was honestly just based on, not to be too commercial here, but just availability of rights issues, and I was trying to balance sort of like quality and accessibility of translation versus how much are we going to have to pay to license this, that kind of thing. So just kind of more pragmatic matters. Beyond that, then I also worked with a copy editor who, specifically cleaned up the text, in kind of ways that I asked him to. I added a number of explanatory footnotes. I didn't want to overload it, and they asked me not to overload it for the purposes of this race. But in some particular places, or with some, and I put in a couple of passages too, just kind of clarifying some of the comments about the Jews in here that you find in the Church Fathers, clarifying certain passages there. And so for what I did is I selected the texts that we were going to use from the 2nd century. I selected the translations. I wrote the introductions to each of the figures involved, and I did a number of explanatory footnotes.
So you are our tour guide of the 2nd century, in effect.
Yeah. I'm the tour guide, and there's any number of ways you could have done something like this. I decided to go where possible with kind of like longer read-in samples, and so even though it's a little turgid, I included all of Clement's epistle to the Corinthians just because it's early and it's long, and it's like you actually get like maybe this is what the church looked like around 95 AD, give or take, for example. Right. And I put in all of Ignatius because you just have to. And then, I was a little more selective with somebody like Irenaeus, for example, because Irenaeus has, 600-700 pages of his writings to survive in. And I think everybody should read more or less all of it versus heresies, or at least books 3 through 5, which are incredible. And I think Irenaeus is the most important theologian in the early church, certainly prior to Origen, and maybe even prior to the Council of Nicaea.
So there are 9 figures, 8 of which are fathers, I believe. Is that correct? Right?
Yeah, I think 5 of which are strictly fathers, and then you have like the Didache, right? And the Didache is what's called like a church order manual, which is this kind of collection of literature that circulates with sort of like partial kind of Christian instructions for Christian initiation. It's kind of a strange literary genre. Then you have the Shepherd of Hermas, which is a prophetic work from about the 140s that there's some ideas about who wrote it. We don't know exactly who wrote it. And then there's something like the letter to Diognetus in here, which we don't know anything about the author. And, scholars, like to speculate in the literature on this, but we don't know. Right. And then there's 5 fathers, the people that was strictly called church fathers. There's the martyrdom of one of the fathers, Polycarp. And then there's also just Tertullian, who is a very important early figure.
Let me be frank, definitely asking the question if Christianity should be weird again, adding to our Lenten season and reflections. You want more of this or other conversations, go to Podcast Central at EWTN.com/podcast. I am Ace McKay. When Catholics Coast to Coast returns, Shameless Popary, helping us to understand how Satanism is something that can point people to the Catholic truths. And so we want to find out what those are this week as we check in with Shameless Popary when Catholics Coast to Coast returns.
The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
Welcome back to Shameless Popary. I'm Joe Heschmeyer, and today I want to try to draw good out of a bad situation. Now, if you are from Kansas or nearby, and particularly if you're a Catholic, there's a good chance you know the bad situation I'm referring to. On March 28th, which if you're watching this on the day it comes out, first on good on you, and second, it's tomorrow. On March 28th, 2025, there is a planned Black Mass celebrated by a satanic group called the Satanic Grotto, intended to mock the Eucharist and to mock the Mass. And I'm going to explain a little more about what all of those things are about, and also, and maybe more importantly, how I think this is actually really important for us to take seriously, not in a way where we get alarmed or terrified by it, but in a way that we do 2 things. Number 1, recognize the spiritual warfare that is actually at the heart of Christianity, properly understood. And number 2, recognize what this says about the Mass. And I'll just make the very short version of that argument right here. There's a reason why the devil hates the Mass in particular. And if you are maybe someone discerning Catholicism, not sure what you should make of the Mass, that's good information for you to know. And I think that should help you to make the right decision. So with that said, I got to do a little bit of background, just explaining when we talk about Satanism, when we talk about the Black Masses, all that stuff, what do we mean by that? Because we can have this idea of just, kind of the cinematic version of Satanism, just this cult of people going around murdering innocent people and offering them to the devil and like that. It's not really like that. And many so-called Satanists are actually just atheists, kind of LARPing, kind of Renaissance fair atheists. I heard someone recently describe them as, where it's just people who want to dress up to be provocative or spooky. Now, please understand, opening a door, even if you're opening because you don't think there's anyone on the other side, can do real damage. But they aren't opening it mindful that there really is a powerful evil entity that they might be letting in. So the group that I put this on, as I said, the Satanic Grotto, Michael Stewart is one of the guys who leads it. And his definition of Satanism is pretty straightforward. There are just two criteria.
We have those two basic, right? That you're rebellious, that you venerate and identify with Satan in some way. That's it, those two, right?
And so there's a diverse group of different organizations claiming the name of Satanist, and a diverse group of organizations that seem to be Satanist, even though they claim not to be. It's complicated. I'll explain a little more as we go. Some of them are what are called theistic Satanists, ones who believe that the devil really does exist and they're trying to worship him. Others are atheistic Satanists, which are usually literally atheists who don't believe in a literal devil, but use the symbol for provocative or political purposes. So running through kind of a very basic overview, you have people like Anton LaVey. He's the guy who wrote the Satanic Bible. He's the founder of the Church of Satan. He's probably the most famous Satanist, maybe of all time. He has kind of an ambiguous relationship. Publicly, he was in the atheist Satanist category, that this is all just like a symbol. But if you read his 11 rules, number 7 says that you need to acknowledge the power of magic if you have employed it successfully to obtain your desires. If you deny the power of magic after having called upon it with success, you will lose all you have obtained. So there are some hints that he wasn't, a strict atheistic materialist who didn't believe in any kind of supernatural or spiritual forces, because he seems to be a believer in magic in a more than metaphorical sense. Additionally, there were those who were around him who said that he secretly did believe in and worship Satan. And the most famous of them is actually a U.S. military lieutenant colonel, Michael Aquino, which is, I'm hoping, not related to the Aquino family that gave us St. Thomas Aquinas. One does not know. Aquino was a former inner circle member of the Church of Satan that broke off because he didn't like some of the practices. People go into schisms. And also because he was convinced that the devil had spoken to him. Now, Aquino is one of the most explicit theistic Satanists in this sense. He believes that there is a literal spiritual being, the Egyptian god Set, who is known by various names, including in the Bible as Satan, and he wants to worship him. Now, because they describe themselves as the temple of Set rather than Satan, they will sometimes resist being called Satanists, but because they think Set and Satan are the same person, I think it's fair to say these are literal theistic Satanists. They're trying to worship the devil, or the figure we call the devil. And significantly, one of the members who joined that was Zena LaVey, Anton LaVey's daughter, who Anton LaVey very publicly baptized and consecrated to Satan when she was young. And so she joined. I believe she eventually split off. It's a complicated, messy sort of situation, but she's still a Setian who still seems to be engaged in demonic spiritual practices. So those are the kind of real deal Satanists, but they are, by basically any reckoning, a minority within the movements. If you look at the number of people calling themselves Satanists, already a pretty small number, thanks be to God. Most of them are just dorky atheists trying to be edgy. And so that includes people like Douglas Mesner and Kevin Solig, who they started the Satanic Temple. So a lot of the stuff you've been seeing, particularly at Capitol buildings, is a political stunt being done by anti-theistic atheists. And so if you're familiar, Lucian Greaves and Malcolm Jerry were their pseudonyms when they started the Satanic Temple. You can get a sense for what they're about by listening to Douglas Mesner, a.k.a. Lucian Greaves, talk about what the goal of their whole movement was.
An interview I did in Vice where the question was, is the Satanic Temple a satanic or satirical group? And I said, that is a common question. I say, why can't it be both? And usually they use this line to show that we don't actually have any sincerity about us at all, that this is all one big prank, a hoax, and that the Satanism component doesn't mean anything to us at all. And I think it comforts a lot of people in this room to also think that as well. But as a matter of fact, there's nothing disingenuous in what we're doing. The values we put forward are values we absolutely adhere to. We're very clear at the fact that we're atheistic and that we feel that religion and supernaturalism can be separated from one another. And we feel that it only benefits us as non-believers that it is separated.
So you'll see something going on there. On the one hand, he's speaking at an atheist conference. This is the 2015 National Conference for American Atheists. And he's been called there in order to basically talk about how they can mess with religious people and troll them and make religious people afraid. And if you think that's a mischaracterization, I'll give you pretty explicit evidence of that in a second. But his response is that he knows is going to make these atheists uncomfortable, but that what he's trying to do in part is separate supernatural stuff from religion. So there does seem, again, to be some creeping in elements of occult spirituality in a genuinely demonic way, but by people who probably, when pressed, would say they don't believe in a literal Satan. So that's what you've got. Like, if you imagine that most of the people who call themselves Satanists believe there's a literal Satan as described in the Bible, they don't. Most of them don't. Some do and have weird theologies about it, like the Sethians, but most don't. There are, however, some who are consciously or unconsciously toying with dark spiritual forces. Even if they don't recognize those as genuinely satanic, they recognize there's something preternatural, or if you put Greaves' spin on it, supernatural about it, and they want this apart from religion. That is genuinely alarming. From a Christian perspective, we know what that is, and it's something to watch out for. And so there are people who are playing around with black forces, whether they know it or not, but there are also people who are just trying to be provocative, just trying to troll, just trying to basically give a middle finger to the world around them. So Jamila Bey, who is the one who introduced Greaves, she's written for, I think she writes for the Washington Post. She gives a pretty good summary of what the American Atheists called them there for. I'll let her speak to it.
We're going to learn a lot, have a lot of fun, and please give us some ideas for how we can do the same thing and make the religious people who want to tell us we can't be in spaces run screaming the way they do when they hear your voice. Lucian Greaves, thank you so much.
So this is what we might call political Satanism. It's the idea of using Satan either to kind of as a figure to express yourself or your agenda, or as a way of trying to scare your opponents or provoke them or troll them. It's some kind of middle finger in the case of the American Atheists, where it's just petulant anti-theism at this point. But in other cases, it's seizing upon Satan as a figure of positive change, as ridiculous as that might sound. And so in that latter category, you take people like Saul Alinsky. Now, Saul Alinsky, I think it's pretty clear, was not literally a Satanist. He did not worship Satan, didn't even pretend to worship Satan. Nevertheless, you may have heard the allegation that he dedicates his 1971 book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer. And if you've seen the fact checks in places like Snopes, they'll say this is mostly false. And the reason they say mostly false is it's not technically a dedication page. It's an acknowledgments page. And only, I think, an author would probably know the difference between those two. But he has a page where he is giving three quotations: Rabbi Hillel, Thomas Paine, the atheist, and then his own quotation. So it's three quotations. And the one from him is that we need to give an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical, upon whom all our legends, mythology, and history, and who's to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which. The first radical known to man, who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that looks like a dedication to Lucifer. If you want to say it's not a dedication, it's an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement, I'm still not going to say that's mostly false. Nevertheless, you see those kind of games people play where it's Lucifer or the devil being a symbol of rebellion or just, radical independence. And so you'll see the devil invoked as a symbol by some elements of the neo-Nazis, some elements of libertarians, and increasingly elements of the political left in the US, particularly the pro-choice left. So I think all of this actually helps to explain where this group, the Satanic Grotto, is coming from. So as I said, Michael Stewart is the guy who is kind of running the show for them, and he's explained that their group is diverse. He puts it in the terms of non-denominational, these different groups of Satanists. He says we have members from TST, that's the Satanic Temple, COS, Church of Satan, and even Luciferians.
What makes you a Satanist? What is it that defines you as a Satanist?
To me personally, I'm atheistic, right? Mm-hmm. But it's having a rebellious attitude. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably one of the biggest things. You have to have that rebellious attitude that defines Satanism. It's the person and how they react to their environment and the things that are going on in the world.
Absolutely. I think that's one of my biggest key factors right there is the adversarial, rebellious attitude. Some people are just born with it. We are naturally that way, and I think that's where a lot of Satanists originate from, right? Down to their core is that need to rebel.
In other words, for the Satanic Grotto, a lot of this isn't actually about believing in Satan because they're atheists. It's about the equivalent of, getting a giant face tattoo or having a weird looking beard where you have to use a rubber band on. It's a way of showing how different you are, how special and unique you are compared to society around you, and how you don't fit in because you're a rebellious nonconformist. And so just realize that's what it is, not an actual thought out theological position. Nevertheless, I want to stress, this is about the dumbest act of rebellion you can do, because if the devil does exist, and he does, you're creating a real possibility to bring spiritual damage upon yourself and those around you. Like, just get a weird face tattoo. The worst that'll do is hurt your chances at employment. And if it wasn't clear enough that this is what's actually going on, well, Michael Stewart says he's studied Saul Alinsky in community organizing, and he is a pro-choice counter-protester for things like the Right to Life marches in Kansas. So this is someone this is a political thing. This is as well just like a personal expression thing, not a theological kind of statement. That's what's up here. Now, additionally, you might be wondering, what is a black mass? And this is a complicated question to answer, because a lot of the alleged black masses in history have been alleged by people who didn't celebrate them themselves and weren't defending them. There were accusations other people celebrated. But broadly, it's any kind of liturgical rite meant to mock the Mass, and particularly involving desecration of a consecrated Eucharist. So there's all sorts of versions of this, from, like in trying to inflict physical violence upon the Eucharist by stabbing it, to having an altar with a naked woman to, as a sign of sexual desecration, to, slaughtering small children. A lot of these are probably made up stories, but nevertheless, this is what a black mass historically is, or is alleged to be. And so if you look at the flyer that the Satanic Grotto puts out for what they're claiming they're going to do, the components are an opening, a denunciation of the word, a denunciation of Christ, desecration of the Eucharist, corruption of the blood, or corruption of the blood, and then closing. It's hard to know how many of these typos are meant to be puns of some kind and how many are just bad spelling. But there you have it. It's meant to clearly mock Christ and to desecrate the Eucharist. And that's something that we as Catholics take extremely seriously. Back in 2014, there was a proposed black mass in Oklahoma, and it was thwarted, thanks be to God, because the Archdiocese of Oklahoma, Oklahoma City, very quickly filed suit and said, you've stolen the Eucharist from a church. If you've got a consecrated host, you clearly didn't consecrate that yourself. You're not a Catholic priest. You've stolen this. You need to return the Eucharist. And they succeeded. They returned the consecrated host, and I have no idea if they went forward with any kind of like black mass, but it was no longer a desecration of the Eucharist because they no longer had a Eucharist to desecrate. And so this time around, Michael Stewart claimed that they'd already secured a consecrated host, and so the Archbishop Naumann of the Archdiocese of Kansas City in Kansas filed suit same thing. This time it resolved a little differently because under oath, Stewart said he actually didn't have a consecrated host. He was lying earlier. They were not in possession of the Eucharist. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, how do we know we can take a Satanist word for it? I'm not sure you can, but he did have receipts. He did have receipts proving that he didn't get this from a church. He got this off of Amazon and that they were unconsecrated hosts. So turns out he maybe doesn't even know what consecration is or the difference between bread and the Eucharist, which, by the way, so many of the articles covering this describe this as a symbol of Jesus, which is not what a consecrated host is. The Eucharist is Jesus. If you want a book on that, I've written one by that name. But the point being, this isn't, it would seem, a real Black Mass, in as much as we can describe anything as a real Black Mass. So this is a pretty ineffective kind of act of desecration for a number of reasons. It doesn't mean it's harmless. I think it's still doing real damage, but calling it a Black Mass, there's a reason I've been kind of using quotation marks. And ironically, I think people like Anton LaVey would find this kind of stupidity ridiculous. He actually spoke against this kind of Black Mass in the Satanic Bible, which, I don't know, is not the place you expect to find opposition to a Black Mass. He puts it like this. He says, no other single device has been associated with Satanism as much as the Black Mass. To say that the most blasphemous of all religious ceremonies is nothing more than a literary invention is certainly a statement which needs qualifying, but nothing could be truer. Okay, well, first of all, if it needs qualifying, then it's also not true that nothing could be truer. Those two statements can't both be true, but fine. That's the least of our issues here. He's right that many of the kind of legends of Black Masses are probably just the invention of somebody's macabre imagination, not an actual liturgy that's gone on. When you have like the mass murder of small children at these satanic altars and no bodies found afterwards, sometimes people are just dreaming this stuff up out of kind of a religious paranoia. I think it's totally fair to acknowledge that. And it's fair to acknowledge that much of what we know about whatever Black Masses may have occurred, like in the medieval period, much of what we know comes from unreliable opponents of those people. So there may well be actual satanic rites that were being performed, but our knowledge of them is heavily compromised. And on that point, I don't think there should be any major dispute. And LaVey argues that the church even like wants this kind of image to exist because it shows how gross Satanists are. He says, if this sounds repugnant, then this, after describing, I'm not going to go into all of the gory details he described. I think I gave enough of a graphic depiction earlier. He says, if this sounds repugnant, then the success of the reports of the Black Mass and keeping the devout in church is easy to understand. No decent person could fail to side with the inquisitors when told of these blasphemies. Now, I would just point out that rhetorically, what he's doing in invoking the inquisitors is the same thing he's accusing Catholics of doing in invoking the Black Mass. You take something that is likely to turn your audience against the person you're describing to try to win them over to your side. It's a clever move, and you see that kind of thing a lot. But the idea there is pretty simple. Like Black Masses, to the extent they exist, the church does want to call out and say, hey, this is evil and demonic, and is a reason we should be Christian and not demon worshipers, say. But LaVey has a deeper critique as well. He says, this is not actually something Satanists do. The usual assumption is that the satanic ceremony or service is always called a Black Mass. A Black Mass is not the magical ceremony practiced by Satanists. The Satanist would only employ the use of a Black Mass as a form of psychodrama. This is written in 1969 when everybody is kind of doing this kind of ridiculousness. But yeah, sure, psychodrama. And that's actually going to be a fair way, I think, of characterizing the proposed Black Mass, of just a public expression of feelings. This is LaVey's argument that such a kind of protest Black Mass, if you want to call it that way, makes sense in the medieval period, does not make sense today. That if you want to say, I'm rebelling from the system, and to show you I'm rebelling, I'm going to desecrate all the stuff you consider holy. Well, in the medieval period, that would obviously be the Mass, because everybody's Catholic. Today, it doesn't really make sense to do that. Here's his argument. Any ceremony considered a Black Mass must effectively shock and outrage, as it seems to be the measure of its success. In the Middle Ages, blaspheming the Holy Church was shocking. Now, however, the Church does not present the awesome image it did during the Inquisition. The traditional Black Mass is no longer the outrageous spectacle to the dilettante or renegade priests that it once was. In other words, if this is 1300 and you want to show the world how rebellious you are, a Black Mass definitely accomplishes that. But in 1969, being anti-Catholic is not a shocking move. It's just normal. And I would argue that in 2025, that's also the case. I understand there are a lot of people who hate the Catholic Church because of its stances on political issues, but maybe you've noticed this is not a small number of people. Maybe you've watched TV and thought to yourself, are Catholic priests usually portrayed in comedies or dramas or fill in the blank in a positive light or a negative light? In other words, whatever the sacred cows are, the untouchable things of our modern era, the Catholic Mass does not appear to be one of those. As evidenced by the fact that almost no journalist covering this story even knows what the Mass is or the difference between a Protestant and Catholic understanding of the Lord's Supper / Eucharist. It is just not 1350 anymore. And Anton LaVey agrees. He says a Black Mass today, if you're trying to go for the thing that's shocking and outrageous and all this, would consist of blaspheming of such sacred topics as Eastern mysticism, psychiatry, the psychedelic movement, ultra-liberalism, etc. Patriotism would be championed. Drugs and their gurus would be defiled. Acultural militants would be deified. And the decadence of ecclesiastical theologies might even be given a satanic boost. Now, he's being funny here, but he's saying the really rebellious renegade thing isn't, I'm not a Christian. It would be I believe the teachings of the Catholic Church. That in 1969, or I would add 2025, that kind of stance is actually much more shocking and rebellious than, I'm a person in my 20s or 30s who likes to wear black and have pentagrams and stuff. That no longer raises an eyebrow nearly as much. And certainly being anti-Catholic, being anti-Mass is just not some bold, avant-garde, edgy position. So I would suggest that even according to Anton LaVey, that the proposed satanic grotto kind of Mass, it fails. It's not a good Black Mass because it's going after the true Mass rather than any of the kind of cultural untouchable things of the day. Now, I would suggest you see this even in the sort of unique way, to put it gently, that the Black Mass is described as being proposed for tomorrow. There is, after the ritual from 11:30 to 12, a 12:30 p.m. praise and worship. Now, obviously, it's to praise and worship the devil, but the fact that you've liturgically innovated even the Black Mass is actually a little bit embarrassing. There's something a kind of darkly comical about the whole thing. And if that's not enough, when you read their description of what this is about, it's about expressing their beliefs and emotions. And then for us, this is therapeutic blasphemy. I cannot tell if blasphemy was supposed to be a play on it's a blessing blasphemy, but given how badly the word therapeutic is spelled there, I think he just doesn't know how to spell therapeutic or blasphemy. Fine, fair enough, but how do you not have someone spell check your flyers? This is the other abomination going on, and it's against grammar. So therapeutic blasphemy and represents how religious oppression has shaped our rebellion. Look, Catholics in Kansas, last I checked, were somewhere between about 13 and 17%. Roughly the portion of the population African Americans are in the U.S. If you think that a group that size is controlling the state and oppressing you, that's laughable. That doesn't make sense. You don't live in that society. So, you can take off your Handmaid's Tale bonnets or your satanic costumes and just live in reality.
Opening our eyes and prayers this week, Shameless Popary. Great stuff as you find out more on this week's episode, or you can go back and stream wherever you are when you go to Podcast Central. That's EWTN.com/podcast, or find Shameless Popary wherever you like to listen to podcasts. That way you know what's happening in future episodes. I'm Ace McKay. Going to enjoy the rest of my weekend. You do the same. Remember to let God define who you are. And I'll see you again with Catholics Coast to Coast.